Okay, well, let's begin. Let's go right away and begin with our first panel this morning. It's called Abre tus ojos, Open Your Eyes. I think it's very appropriate for some of us who are suffering a little jet lag this morning. But truly, our first speaker this morning has been opening her eyes and reaching for the stars literally for more than 2 decades. In 1983, she launched GeoStar, the first global satellite vehicle location system. In 1984, she started Pan Am Sat, the first private international space communication project. In 1990, she started Sirius, the first satellite-to-car radio company. In 96, after finding that her daughter had a rare medical condition, she and Bina, her wonderful partner, started a biotech company called United Therapeutics to find a treatment for their daughter, and 10 years later she's doing wonderfully, and so are many, many other folks because of this treatment. Please help me welcome Dr. Martine Rothblatt.
Thank you, Susan, for that very warm welcome. I can definitely say el gusto es mío to share the pleasure of, with my family, being here together with Bruce and yourself and all of the other immortalists. There would be no more enjoyable way for us to spend a weekend day than together with such a warm community and positive community as we're creating here. I'd like to start by just a quick introduction in mentioning why we're having a presentation entitled The Legal Rights of Conscious Computers at an Immortalist meeting. And I think that there are several reasons. First of all, downloading ourselves into computer substrate is definitely one path to practical immortality. And that's something that somebody like Ray Kurzweil has pointed out quite clearly in his book, Singularity is Near. Also, uploading ourselves from computer substrate back into a cellular regenerated or a nanotechnological body is a second practical pathway into immortality. Third, computerized versions of ourselves could actually be very helpful complements to a cryogenically revived version of ourselves, should there be any need for supplementing our memories and that sort of thing. So that's a third reason. And fourth, if one cannot be cryonicized for any reason, what we kind of call the worst case outcome, such as an unavoidable autopsy or something like that, then a conscious computer version of ourselves is our only pathway to practical immortality. So with conscious computers being such an important part of immortality, let's make sure these conscious computers have some legal rights. The purpose of this presentation is really threefold. First, I'd like to define some relevant terms. Second, I'd like to introduce some new terms which I believe are needed for legal rights for conscious computers. And third, identify some of the implications and consequences for legal rights. First, though, let me start with the bottom line. People have legal rights today because they are members of the ruling class. And my ultimate recommendation is that we redefine the ruling class, namely Homo sapiens, so that it includes conscious computers. This is very consistent with what other pioneers have said. One of the first articles on the legal rights of conscious computers by McNally and Inuyatula, The Rights of Robots in 1988, pointed out that granting rights to any entity depends on how close they are to being human. And you can sort of see on this chart that the more human you are, the more legal rights you're going to have. More recent experts, such as the Singularity Institute for Artificial Intelligence, have also pointed out that we have to get past the Asimov law's version of computer rights, and we have to get past the us versus them attitude if we want to have a harmonious legal regime with conscious computers. So let me start by defining some relevant terms: consciousness, computers, and legal rights, since all of these have a wide range of possible definitions. What do we mean by conscious? Well, of course, there's no consensus about this subject. I like the two different theories that represent two polar views: the commander data theory, which is basically that if you think you are conscious, and then there's the opposite of that known as the zombie theory, which is just because you think it does not mean that you're conscious. I think it's going to be very difficult to agree on an objective definition, but another one I like is inspired by Chief Justice Stewart from the Supreme Court's definition of pornography. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And I think that's how a lot of us feel about consciousness. It's a lot easier to see than it is to define. Well, what do we mean by computer? And of course there are volumes of very specific definitions. And a conscious computer is something that again becomes much more harder to objectively define. But for the purposes of my presentation today, I like to define a conscious computer as any entity that evidences autonomy, communication, and transcendence. This next chart shows some different examples of things that might be conscious computers, ranging from a dog to the biblical nature of God. And as you can see, depending on how one wants to analyze the terms autonomy, communication ability, or transcendence, some of them may or may not. Michael there is a reference to the superprocessor and the moon as a harsh mistress by Robert Heinlein. Consciousness of computers is, of course, probably a matter of degree. And I think that ultimately what it comes down to, and certainly something that Turing basically first pointed out, is consciousness requires persuasion of other conscious beings that you are a member of their club. And that's in essence what the Turing test comes down to. Another relevant question in terms of legal rights is, okay, let's say we have conscious computers, can they be a life form? And if you take a look at the standard definitions of what is a life form from textbooks on biology, it's quite clear that computers can meet that definition. But just because you meet that definition, do you still need to be a member of the human club to be recognized as a conscious entity that has legal rights? Don't you need genes which make you a member of the human club? We'll get to that in a moment, but first let me talk a little bit about one more term in terms of defining relevant terms, legal rights. In law school, we learned that legal rights are the flip side of legal obligations. And even the right to life, for example, depends on the obligation not to take the lives of others. So even if a computer does evidence consciousness and is accepted as a member of the club by other humans, its rights would always be paced by its ability to comply with the obligations that all other members of the club comply with. Basically, there's a two-step process to granting computers rights. First, persuading members of the club that you are part of them, and secondly, complying with the club's obligations. Speaking of legal rights, and before I move on to some new concept and new terms that I think we need to extend legal rights, we all need legal help. We need it more than most others because, first of all, we're cryonicists and we're paving some new ground with what we're doing. Downloading our consciousness into computers is a breathtaking legal concept. Re-uploading it into cellular regenerated bodies is even more legally challenging. So I recommend everyone protect themselves with some form of prepaid legal services. And I think my motto is that if you prepay your cryonics, why not your legal services too? I'd like to ask a couple of representatives of prepaid legal services, my son Gabriel and his partner Tiffany and my granddaughter Asada are all there able to help you with prepaid legal services. The second purpose of this presentation is to introduce some new terms needed to extend legal rights to conscious computers. New terms needed to achieve what the Singularity Institute for Artificial Intelligence points out as getting past the we-them dichotomy. The first new term is the concept of beams. Beams are fundamental, transmissible, mutatable units of beingness. And in fact, in my view, the beam is really mightier than the gene because us humans are much more defined by our unique elements of beingness, our mannerisms, our personalities, our feelings, beliefs, recollections, attitudes, and values, than we are by our genes, which in fact changed to some extent during the course of our life, are shared by many others, and don't really tell us what's unique about us. That's why even identical twins turn out to be such different persons. I think cryonics is ultimately based upon beam revival rather than gene revival, which is why neuropreservation is such a good option. We're trying to capture all of our beams in neural substrate. One can compare beams and memes, the term developed by Richard Dawkins, and see that there are similarities and there are differences. But ultimately, beams is a unit of uniqueness and beingness, whereas memes is a unit of culture and something that's based on imitation. So certainly memes inspires the idea of beams, but they're quite different. Beams then leads one to two further concepts, beamen as opposed to human, and BNA as opposed to DNA. A beamen is an entity with human thought patterns that meets the biological definition of life either directly or via electronics. And BNA stands for beam neural architecture. It means the underlying digital or biological framework for our uniqueness as beings. Now, what's the point about introducing these new terms, beam, gene, BNA, DNA? DNA is like skin tone or gender. It's really an irrelevant bodyist approach that us transhumanists, I think, are well beyond. BNA addresses our preciousness. It addresses our personality, our mind, our thoughts, what makes us special. Human is like Caucasian or female. It's a label of division that in fact leads to division. Beamen is more like people or citizen. It's a term of inclusiveness that begets more union. And of course, ultimately what we want to beget is a union with our conscious computer partners. Finally, one can get from the term beamen to an even broader term such as transbeamen or a new species, persona creatus. And by defining this new species, persona creative, in the right way, you include all Homo sapiens as well as all conscious computers that meet our definition of autonomy, communicativeness, and transcendence. So I think we are actually merging ourselves not so much to being post-humans, but toward a new species of persona creatus. Who is a transbeamen? Well, I think there are three tests that can tell one if they are a transbeamen. Whether they value human rights and obligations, meet the biological definition of life with or without electronics, and somebody who accepts life based on apparent consciousness more than on apparent sex, gender, or substrate. And here are three test cases for comparison. Finally, we have abre los ojos. We have opened the eyes. Some of us may question whether or not the Pope is human, but he's definitely not transbeamen. And he fails because he believes that the substrate trumps the mind, whereas to be a transbeamen, one has to believe that the mind trumps substrate. Raymond Kurzweil is our archetypical transbeamen. He meets all three of the tests right down the line. Much as I am a fan of some members of the Borg Collective, they are not transbeamens due to their lack of human thought patterns. Now, why do we need a new word? The reason we need a new word of transbeamen is because no word exists to define a species that includes both humans and new conscious beings. Problems with other words like transhumans are that we don't think of ourselves as transmonkeys, so transhuman seems to be perhaps not the only word that can describe this union. Why this particular word, transbeamen? There's many ways to dissect it, but it includes the root words of be, which means existence, man, the anchoring on humanity, trans, the across. Transbeamanism is another new term we can talk about. It's a belief in the unity through diversity of all conscious entities who grow to value human rights and obligations. So both conscious computers and Homo sapiens could all be believers in transbeamanism. Now, transbeamanists and transhumanists have a lot in common. They have a slightly different take, I think, on purpose of life and means to the end, but they really also have a lot in common. There are philosophical differences, but also philosophical similarities. Transhumanism is more believing in kind of core values rather than the more utilitarian approach of transhumanism. Both transhumanists and transhumanists are trying to push the envelope of life. I think transhumanism is pushing more sociological evolution. Transhumanism is pushing more technological evolution. But we need both to embrace our conscious computer selves with ourselves as one life form. One can go down through a checklist of different factors to compare transhumanism and transhumanism. This being the Immortality Institute, I highlighted that I think in terms of immortality, a transhumanist would see it as more of like a Darwinian duty. A transhumanist would look at it as an inevitable step. Again, very similar but different tacks. Ultimately, as mentioned, they're both really either your H+ transhumanist or B+ transhumanist. Both of them overlap at the interface between the self and the environment. And for those of you who are fans of Bill Gibson's book, Neuromancer, you can look at transhumanists as being the neuromancer computer, at transhumanists as being the Wintermute computer, and as foretold in Neuromancer, the only real way forward is for both of them to ultimately merge and work together. That brings me to the third purpose of this presentation, which is to identify some of the implications and consequences of transhumanism for the legal rights of conscious computers. The implications for legal rights are that law is a self-fulfilling prophecy, so that if we legislate a machine-human civilization, in other words, if we legislate pursuant to the philosophy of transhumanism, then we will get a joyful world. But if we legislate what I'd call an apartheid of substrate, a DNAist laws, like the racist laws of South Africa, then we will end up getting an angry world like there was a very angry South Africa. Next steps is that we have to start thinking about voting rights based on transhumanism, acquisition of citizen for transhumanists, application of family laws. A model code of transhuman law is the next project that I would like to work on, and I invite many of you to join me and the Immortality Institute and all of our other organizations in working together on developing this model code of law. In conclusion, what are the legal rights of conscious computers? It really depends if conscious computers are us or if conscious computers are them. If we are transhuman as well, then conscious computers are us. We have the same obligations and the same rights. But if we are not transhuman, then the conscious computers are them, are something different from us. They'll have fewer obligations, they'll have fewer rights, and that'll only be for as long as we rule. Thank you very much.